Hi everyone, welcome to chapter 7. So this chapter we're going to talk all about motivation and emotion. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. All right, so chapter 7, motivation and emotion. Let's talk through a little bit of this. We're going to start first looking at actually emotions and talking a little bit about that. So how do we understand others? How do we understand other people's emotions, how they're feeling, how they're expressing sort of these different types of thoughts and feelings and behaviors? And so when we look at this image, we can kind of see a lot of different things and that help us sort of understand what emotions these people might be feeling. Well, we can obviously see that they appear to be pretty happy, right? So we can see their facial expressions. We can also tell from their body language and how they're sitting, how they're presenting themselves with each other. So these are all different ways that we kind of interpret emotions and kind of get these senses from each other, in sort of this natural way. And so when we talk about emotions and what they actually are, there's a couple key things that we want to identify and that we want to sort of point out. And so in psychology, we say that emotions encompass two things, that being psychological and physiological states. And that both of these two things together actually comprise what our emotions are and what our emotions are sort of representing. And so we see both sort of cognitive or psychological aspects of emotions that change, and we sort of feel different ways when we're experiencing and expressing different emotions. But we also have physiological changes that go along with those and that we see sort of, come out. And so, for example, we might see when we are angry or stressed or have heightened emotions, we might see a faster heart rate or, different types of, physiological responses within the body that pair with those types of emotions. Let's talk now about some different functions and sources of emotions. So let's talk first about where emotions come from. So what are different sources of emotions and what really kind of causes these emotions to come out? We can talk about a lot of different examples here. We can look at different types of reinforcers. So sort of like what we talked about in previous chapters with learning. So we might learn different things that cause different types of emotions. So we've learned that, maybe some type of positive enforcer or negative enforcer might lead to these negative emotions or positive emotions, respectively. Maybe we see some other things like, the intensity of the reinforcer affects the emotion. Maybe something that's really intense is going to bring out a stronger level of an emotion, or something that is maybe not that big of a deal is not going to evoke a huge emotion. We see things like, just for example, very simply, the antecedent stimuli. So basically just, whatever comes first. So that could be anything in the environment, anything presented to you that might cause some type of emotional response. But we also have things like, conditioned reinforcers, which are things that we have learned to have some emotional response to. And then we also have unconditioned reinforcers, which are just natural things in our environment that we don't have to learn, but naturally elicit some type of emotional response. And so each of these things kind of results in a different source of emotions. And so there's lots of things that can trigger and cause emotions and emotional responses. But so what are the functions? What's the use of emotions, and why do we have them in the first place? Well, there's a lot of things that they actually can do. First off, we can see that they can help us to elicit different hormonal responses or physiological responses. We talked about how those two things kind of go hand in hand with emotion a couple slides ago, but this can be a beneficial thing when we need certain physiological sort of things to happen. So if we are in danger and we need to prepare our body or have some physiological response to that danger, emotion can kind of go with that and help us sort of have those two things happen. Even as simple as something like motivation, right? Emotion can help motivate us to do something. It can help us communicate with each other and share different pieces of information, whether that's positive through some positive emotion or maybe danger or fear through other types of emotions, which in turn leads to things like social bonding, helping us sort of, have these shared senses or these shared experiences and emotions with each other. They can help us evaluate our memories. That's a really interesting one. So we can see, if we're looking back on something and we remember the emotional component of what happened, that can help us have stronger memory of that thing and have, a solid foundation of what the meaning or the takeaway of that memory might have been. Again, helps with the storage of memory, right? Makes those memories stronger because we have emotional ties and emotional components that we can remember as well. And perseverance, it can help us to, again, motivate ourselves or have us be able to sort of persevere in areas because of that sort of emotional component tied to them. So we can see that there are lots of different functions and lots of different purposes that emotions serve for us as people, and also we can see in other animals and species as well. So when we talk about emotion, we can also kind of break down and talk about sort of the evolution of emotion and how this fits into how emotion has developed, again, through our own species, but also other species as well. And so when we do this, we can see a couple different things. We can see that emotions have different components to them, right? So we can see that each emotion, we can sort of specify a few different characteristics. We can specify when we might experience that emotion. We can specify how the emotion might affect us and how the behavior might solve some evolutionary problems. So we'll see that an example on the next slide as well. But also, like I mentioned before, we can kind of point out and talk about how these emotions have ties and affect changes in other areas of ourselves, such as hormones, thoughts, feelings, behaviors, facial expressions, or even different ways that we can even sense or perceive the environment around us. And so Darwin actually looked at sort of these three main principles of emotions from this evolutionary perspective. And they're kind of interesting to kind of break down and look at. So the first one is this idea of principle of serviceable habits. And this is really the idea that early on in early species and other species, we saw that the behaviors that were associated with emotions were actually directly sort of related to what that emotion was trying to convey. So for example, a dog baring its teeth when it's angry or aggressive. And so that helped to demonstrate these cues and these meanings or thoughts behind what that emotion was trying to convey. Whereas for people, we don't really have this aspect anymore, but instead any type of sort of response or facial response from emotion is really sort of just a lingering effect of this. Not necessarily that there are actual meaningful outcomes to the facial expressions or the actual kind of things that are trying to be conveyed, but that those things still being a part of our emotions are there just sort of out of long-term evolutionarily formed habits. The second one is the principle of antithesis. And so this is really an interesting one, but it's that opposite emotions have opposite bodily expressions. And so we can look at an example of this in, say, again, an animal being aggressive where they're standing big and tall and baring their teeth and having these strong, large physical expressions of their emotions, whereas an animal being timid or shy or submissive might be really curled up, make themselves smaller, tail tucked in, things like that. And so opposite emotions show opposite bodily sort of expressions as well. And then the third one here is the principle of direct action, or basically just what we've been talking about, that we see direct relationships with the nervous system to these emotional components as well. And so when you're afraid or when you're nervous, you might break out in a sweat or, might have these different heart racing components as well. But that these aren't things that we're consciously choosing to do, but that they are, just associated with this emotion from a purely biological standpoint.